So, Michael and Jim, how would we describe Jim on the Big Five traits, and are they sufficient to describe him? And how would we describe Michael? I'd like to start with Michael. He knows no one wants him at the party. He somehow gets someone to break into the emails, and then he figures out where the party is. He shows up. He's not embarrassed. He doesn't apologize. He immediately tries to take over the party. He starts ordering people about. He sings. He tells people to come up. And so what trait do you think he's at an extreme on, or what collection of traits? Yeah. Yeah. So he's on the lacking in empathy and understanding, so he's, so low on agreeableness, for sure. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, that's a good one. We'll talk more about neuroticism with him. I was thinking conscientiousness, because he doesn't abide by rules and norms that everyone else abides by. But, I mean, the terms we might use is he's a buffoon, he's a clown, he's a jerk. I often use the term a character. He's like this weird character. And character, that's a term that I think is getting toward the issue of whether there might be a personality disorder, like a really extreme but consistent way of acting. Now, so I'm thinking that with Michael, the question is whether you have to go beyond the Big Five traits and talk about a personality disorder. Now with Jim, you don't see him that much there, but he does something that's absolutely amazing, so that he's presented with a social dilemma where he has this party, he's with the girl who he knows is likely the love of his life, and his boss comes and kind of destroys the party. And, you know, if I think about myself in that situation, I would figure I have two options. One is I could just stay quiet and let the boss ruin the party. The second is I could get up and throw the boss out. Both of those options are bad, but that's all I could come up with. In the clip we saw, you see that Jim does something else. He does something that kind of saves the whole night. He gets up, even though he's upset at Michael, and even though you could see in his face, he gets up and he sings with Michael, and he puts his arm around him. And he's communicating that I forgive this guy, and I like this fellow, and we should all still have a good time. And I don't think any of us could have come up with that solution. So what I would suggest, one thing I would suggest is that Pam, that's the scene where Pam fell in love with Jim. And if she didn't fall in love with him, I would have fallen in love with him. Because you could see there's something, now he's an agreeable guy, but there's something very special that you see in that scene. So I think with Jim, you might be wondering, is he one of these extreme personalities on the positive end? Does he have some character virtue that sets him apart from the rest of us? Okay, so I'll talk about personality disorders, and then I'll talk about character virtues. And throughout most of this, I'll be trying to come back to the big five. So here's the classic definition of a personality disorder. It's a lasting, stable, maladaptive pattern of behavior. It deviates from a person's culture. That's really important when you're making a diagnosis of personality disorder, is to consider what the cultural norms are. And it's manifested as inappropriate emotions, cognitions, lack of impulse control. And it's something to be diagnosed if you're an adult. It had to be recognizable in childhood or adolescent. And it needs to be continuing throughout your adult life. Now, something that's really important in the classic definition, but in current definitions, a personality disorder is only a personality disorder if it's causing impairment in your work and relationships. So many of us might think, in fact, when you read about personality disorders, you'll say, oh boy, that sounds like me, that sounds like me, that sounds like me. But in fact, you know, a lot of us may show extreme behaviors, extreme patterns for short periods of time, or maybe at a certain developmental period of time. But the persistence and the long-term nature of these patterns is what characterizes a personality disorder. Okay. There are 10 personality disorders. I'll be focusing on narcissism because it's the most relevant to the other material I talk about in class, in future lectures. And there's 3 basic clusters. The first cluster has to do primarily with odd patterns of thinking. The second cluster has to do with erratic patterns of behavior, and the narcissistic is in that second cluster. And the third cluster has to do with erratic emotional patterns, and it's mostly tied into anxiety and fearfulness. Now, I provide this is from McAdams' textbook, when he had a textbook on personality. And there's just a sketch, a capsule summary of each of the personality disorders. I'm focusing on narcissistic, and usually narcissists are described as grandiose, lacking empathy, and having a need for admiration. Now, I have a feeling that Michael Scott fits the bill, and I'm going to show you a compilation of some of his...
People say, I am the best boss. They go, God, we've never worked in a place like this before. You're hilarious. And you get the best out of us. I think that pretty much sums it up. I found it at Spencer Gifts.
I'm an early bird and I'm a night owl, so I'm wise and I have worms.
Do I need to be liked? Absolutely not. I like to be liked. I enjoy being liked. I have to be liked. But it's not like this compulsive need to be liked, like my need to be praised.
Wikipedia is the best thing ever. Anyone in the world can write anything they want about any subject. So you know you are getting the best possible information.
The rules of shotgun are very simple and very clear. The first person to shout shotgun when you're within the sight of the car gets the front seat. That's how the game's played. There are no exceptions for someone with a concussion.
What is wrong with these people? They have no willpower. I once went 28 years without having sex. And then again for 7 years.
I saved a life. My own. Am I a hero? I really can't say, but yes.
Okay, so that's a compilation, and it is pretty typical. And I think grandiose, so need to be liked, need to be admired, need to be praised. It's front and center with Michael Scott. Grandiosity, is he a hero because he saved himself from doing something stupid? Yes, he is, he thinks. Lack of empathy, you have a concussion, you should be sitting up front. Tough luck. The rules of shotgun are whoever calls it gets to sit up front. So that thumbnail description, now the way a personality disorder of narcissism would actually be diagnosed, there'd be a clinical interview by a psychiatrist or a psychologist. There's a structured way of doing these interviews. There's 9 key symptoms that are evaluated, and if you have 5 of them, you can be diagnosed with a personality disorder. So here are some famous people who they think had personality disorders. I forget the name of this lady, but one of the things they have found is most reality TV stars, someone did a study where they had them fill out a narcissism scale, and they score higher than anyone. So Paris Hilton, that's her. Yes, I remember now. But so here are some of the clinically significant symptoms that a psychiatrist would look for. So reacting to criticism with anger, taking advantage of others to reach your own goals, exaggerating your own importance, requiring constant attention and positive reinforcement, lacking empathy, being obsessed with yourself. I'm only showing 9. I'm pretty sure that Michael Scott would score on, 5 or 6 of those. So he probably would score on personality disorders. Now, the problem with personality disorders is that the diagnosis is very unreliable, so that if you have 10 psychiatrists watching the same diagnostic interview, they're likely to come up with 4 or 5 different diagnoses for the same person. So it's very unreliable. With the diagnosis of narcissism, you only need 5 symptoms out of 9. So that means that you could find 2 people who are diagnosed with narcissism, but they only share one of the 5 symptoms. And they, in fact, might be quite heterogeneous. The other problem is that often people can be diagnosed or classified for multiple personality disorders. So generally there's a concern about the reliability of this kind of categorical diagnosis. And there's also a serious concern about the clinical utility of this categorical way of diagnosing things. Now, most medical illnesses are diagnosed in a categorical way. The example that I often see given is pregnancy. That's a categorical thing. You're either pregnant or you're not. Appendicitis. You either have appendicitis or you don't. Personality is a more abstract, vague concept, and it's very hard, I think, to argue that you can clearly define a category of personality qualities that capture narcissism, let's say. So recently, in 2013, there was a move toward abandoning the categorical classification and instead adopting a continuous or a dimensional approach. And many people were saying, there's already a very reliable and valid system for categorizing variations in personality, and it's the Big 5 trait system. Why not use that system to try to understand extreme personalities. So the two leading researchers who developed the Big Five trait system, Costa and McCrae, they wrote something that I've put here. And this is plausible to me, but I think they're wrong in a couple of the things they suggest, and I'll point that out. So they would say the research indicates that Axis 2 diagnostic categories for personality disorders may in fact be classifiable in terms of the 5 factors. Okay, let me explain. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that you'll learn about when you take psychopathology involves a first judgment as to whether an individual has a common mental disorder. When you think about mental health problems, you probably think about mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and substance use disorders. Those are the 3 most common mental health problems. And Axis 1 disorders involve more acute, transitory mental health difficulties. And it does seem like for those, it's useful to think of them maybe in a categorical way. So if someone has a major depression, it usually comes on. You can understand what it's a reaction to. It has a certain course, and there's various treatments that have been developed. So the Axis 1, there's a categorical approach. It makes sense. Axis 2 is where the personality disorders come in, and there's some questions because there isn't a real course. It's a continuous kind of thing, whether it makes sense to think about it as a specific problem that emerges or a specific category. So here are some of the things that McCrae and Costa would suggest. So introversion, extroversion, they're suggesting that extremely low extroversion might be what we think of as a schizoid disorder. Those are people who are really into themselves and who just aren't interested in social contact very much. There's something called a histrionic disorder. It's a personality disorder where people are very theatrical and they're constantly putting on different acts and roles. And the question, one suggestion was that that might be high extroversion. Now, I'll tell you that I think that one's wrong. I'm almost certain that's wrong. High extroversion is associated with high levels of positive affect, high levels of social activity. You probably know some incredibly highly extroverted people, and you don't get a sense that necessarily there's some personality problem there. So my hunch is that that one's wrong. The next one is they say that someone who's extremely agreeable, highly agreeable, might develop or might have a dependent personality disorder. I'm certain that that is wrong too. So I think Jim and Pam, who we've watched, they're extremely high on agreeableness. Being high on agreeableness does not mean that you will be submissive and dependent. In fact, being submissive and dependent comes from low extroversion, and it comes from low social confidence. So it's from the negative side. Antisocial disorder linked with quarrelsomeness, that makes sense to me. The last one I'll tell you about, and I've heard many students suggest it, is the most common comment that people make. They say, high conscientiousness, isn't there a risk of being too conscientious to the point where you get perfectionistic and obsessive compulsive? And I was really surprised that Costa Costa and McCrae suggest, yeah, high conscientious will be associated with obsessive compulsive axis 1 and axis 2 diagnosis. And I think that's wrong. And they've actually collected Big Five scores from people who've been diagnosed as obsessive compulsive. And they are actually significantly lower on conscientiousness. Because if you're conscientious, it's all about being efficient, setting goals, changing your strategies, pursuing things in a way so you could get things done efficiently. If you're obsessive compulsive, or if you're perfectionistic in a maladaptive way, what that's about is having rituals and being slow and being inefficient. So if I'm obsessive compulsive, that means when I go home today, before I sit down to study, I'm going to have to spend an hour or two doing a variety of rituals that I do to keep myself from feeling panic. So I would question, generally I think with the Big Five traits, when there's a positive and a negative end, and we can see them for most of the traits, being at the positive end, I don't think there's any evidence that that would lead to a personality disorder. And most often I think it's a misunderstanding. Now, I haven't challenged McCrae and Costa, the leaders of the field, with this insight, but I'll say more about it as we go along. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, but it's always in the interest of meeting your goals and being efficient, I think. So I don't think it's unnecessary control. That's a different thing that, well, I'll say more about it, but self-control is central to conscientiousness. But excessive self-control, which is compulsion and inhibition, isn't, I don't think. Okay, McAdams points out that, yes, there's some links. I have to go on, I'm sorry, I have so much to do. There's links between traits and personality disorders, but what he highlights, and I have to remind you of this, there's more to personality than the Big Five traits. There's level 2, which has to do with personal concerns, and it has more motivational things. Power motivation, achievement motivation. It has to do with your developmental tasks. It has to do with attachment and autonomy. So these level 2 constructs may well be involved in whether you would categorize someone with a personality disorder. And there's also just a life history, which is level 3 of his model of personality, which would seem to be importantly involved in a diagnosis of personality as well. Now, here is the rationale. There was a big fight in 2013-14 when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual came out, because all of the best researchers in clinical and personality psychology said you have to abandon the categorical system. And instead, you have to try to come up with a dimensional system that's modeled after the Big Five. And they argued that the evidence in favor of the Big Five, it's called the five-factor model, FFM, is overwhelming from a scientific empirical point of view. So they would say the Big Five is clear, it has cross-cultural validity, it's clear you could trace the childhood antecedents of the Big Five traits in terms of early temperament and other things. The temporal stability, I'll talk to you next week, it's remarkable. There's a predictable life course to the Big Five traits so that they increase and decrease at various times of our lives. They're highly predictive of positive and negative life outcomes. And most recently, and this is really what's going to seal the evidence in favor of the five-factor model, the behavioral genetic evidence is very strong. And in fact, there's molecular genetic support for the trait of neuroticism. And there's now neurobiological correlates that have been associated with different of the big five traits. So rather than relying on a categorical system that can be traced to psychoanalytic theorizing from the 1920s, Chris Hopwood and many other empirical personality and clinical researchers said it's time to abandon that. So what they did was they said, we're going to keep the old categorical system, but if you really want, we have a new dimensional system for you. And this alternative dimensional system has two aspects to it. So they will focus on the extremity of behaviors on certain personality dimensions. But before they do that, they also make a judgment as to whether you've reached a threshold level of personality functioning. And I'll describe what they mean by that. So mostly it's, does the person have a coherent, active personality? And then how can we characterize their behavior on some pathological trait dimensions? So on the first part, as to whether you have kind of a threshold, healthy baseline personality, what they look at is the integrity of the self and the integrity of your relational capacities. So the first thing they'll ask is there a clear identity? Does the person have an understanding of who they are, of what qualities they have? Do they have an accurate understanding? Do they understand how they come across to others? So do they have a coherent identity? And are there boundaries to this identity? Can they differentiate themselves from others? Okay, let's go back to Michael Scott, the goofy boss. Do you think he has a clear, accurate understanding of himself and how he comes across to others? Has anyone watched the show? No. He has no clue. Everyone believes he's a ridiculous, obnoxious person, and he thinks he's well loved and esteemed. So there's no correspondence there. So right away you would say, uh-oh, he has a problem with identity. The second aspect is self-direction, and that has to do with whether people have a coherent set of personal goals and they're able to work constructively toward them. With Michael Scott, I'm not sure on that one. I think he is a good salesperson. He actually does want to get into a relationship. He does want to have friends. So I see more evidence of self-direction with him. Now, once you've decided, okay, there may be some problems on the self side, the next question is, how would you characterize the person's relationships? The first thing you look for is, does the person have empathy? Do they understand and appreciate another person's perspective, feelings, motivations, etc.? Michael Scott shows a lot of evidence that he has problems in that area. He does learn and he does improve over the course of the 8 years, but early on I think you would have to say he's really lacking. He also has no history of close friendships, and the real test with friendships and romantic relationships is whether they're reciprocal and there's mutual caring and consideration. So the first step in this new system is there's a dimensional coding. It's a 1 to 5 scale where 1 means everything looks great, 2 means it's pretty good, 3, 4, and 5 is moderate to severe problems, either in the structure of the self or the structure of your relationships. And if you have moderate to severe, that means you've passed the first criteria, and they'll continue to consider a personality disorder diagnosis. Now, here's where I think it gets interesting and very relevant to what the course covers. The next step is to characterize the nature of the personality disorder. It has to be something that's relatively inflexible and it's been there for a certain amount of time. What they've done is they followed the same kind of lexical approach as when the Big Five were derived, only they began with a list of all of the negative or pathological terms we might use to describe someone's behavior or someone's emotions or someone's thoughts. And they boiled that down to 25 somewhat distinct categories, dimensions of problematic personality type traits. Then they did a factor analysis, and they ended up with 5 factors. And the hope was that the 5 factors that emerged would look like the more negative end of the original 5-factor system. And you'll see that in 4 of the 5 dimensions, there's a really nice matchup. So the pathological personality domains, there's now a 210-item personality inventory that you can take. I took it 2 days ago, and I was really excited to see what I came up with. It took me like 45 minutes. It's not pleasant to do because it's only like kind of negative things. But then I finished, and they didn't give me any feedback. They just said, thank you. You can put you can indicate if you want to be enrolled in a lottery to win 10 pounds of British money. And I thought, what am I going to do with 10 pounds of British money? But you can find this online, but they have a well-constructed scale, and that scale breaks down so that it will give you summary scores, dimensional scores on these 5 things. Negative affectivity to emotional stability. That's the first factor. Right away you can guess negative affectivity, that kind of sounds like neuroticism. The second one is detachment versus extroversion. And that's the lower end of extroversion, but I don't think it's the same as introversion. So there might be something, I'm sure there's something qualitatively different. Then the negative end of agreeableness on this new personality disorder inventory is called antagonism. The negative end of conscientiousness, I always struggle. I always call it carelessness. What they actually found is it's disinhibition. It's the inability to regulate your impulses and to exercise self-control. It's the tendency to say things that pop into your head, even if they're inappropriate. The final one is psychoticism versus lucidity, and they thought that this had to do with openness to experience, but I don't think it matches very well. So this is an example of the items, and there's, like I said, there's 210 items. So there's plenty of people out to get me. People would describe me as reckless. I often have ideas that are too unusual to tell anyone. I avoid risky situations. That's probably a reversal. But here's the thing that they did was, in a number of studies, they measured these pathological dimensions, and they also measured the big five. And then they did the statistical technique where they put the distributions on top of one another. And what they found is that for 4 of their 5 dimensions, okay, I'm doing that wrong. So for 4 of the 5 dimensions, the curves overlap pretty nicely. So it looks like for neuroticism, for conscientiousness, for extroversion, and for agreeableness, you can look at the negative end of those dimensions. And it does seem like you could measure those in terms of more maladaptive tendencies. The place it did not work at all was openness to experience. You see this line here? That's actually supposed to be matching up with that. So they totally failed to find a link between openness to experience and the pathological dimension that they found that emerged. And what the researchers would say is, I'm not sure how they see this, but they actually would say that at the extreme negative end of the big 5 traits, you get much finer distinction and better prediction if you use this new scale. So there's an added value to not only measuring the big 5, but then to including this maladaptive trait item scale. And they think it's going to be very useful in understanding the course of personality disorders, and also figuring out how to intervene and treat these disorders. Now, the 5th domain, openness, intellect, or unconventionality, those researchers said it describes creativity, intellect, imagination, and the opposite end is, but it also can be having weird, creative, peculiar, unconventional. And I think what they were getting at is actually something more like very loose thinking, disorganized thinking, a little bit like a normal level of psychoticism or psychotic tendencies. I don't think it's getting at openness to experience. Now, what they're able to do is, the serious personality and clinical researchers would say that there's only evidence for 6 personality disorders. They've gotten rid of 4 of them because there was never any convincing evidence. And the way they will diagnose personality disorders is, first they find out whether there's a problem with the self or with relationships. And if there's no problem, they don't proceed. You don't have to look for the pathological traits. The first criterion is that there's problems in living. If there is, then they give the 5 scales, and they've been able to identify where you would look to diagnose different things. I only want to focus on narcissistic personality disorder, and you can see there's a very specific, straightforward way to diagnose. So there's 2 facets of antagonism which clearly differentiate someone with a narcissistic personality disorder, and that is grandiosity and attention seeking, And I would suggest that Michael Scott probably scores very high on that. And because there were concerns about his self and his interpersonal relationships, I would bet that he would be diagnosed with a personality disorder and it would be narcissistic. Okay,